This is E&P Reports from Editor and Publisher Magazine, the authoritative voice of news media since 1884, serving newspapers, broadcasts, digital, and all multimedia news publishing. And hi, once again, Mike Blinder, publisher of E&P Magazine Quick Housekeeping. If you are listening to us on your favorite audio podcast platform, Google, Apple, Spotify, Deezer, what have you, just follow us, please. Watching us on our YouTube channel, hit that bell and subscribe button below the screen, and you'll get an update each and every time we upload a new episode of E&P Reports. I am accompanied today by Jon Marshall. You teach media history and reporting as an associate professor at Northwestern. Am I correct, school?
That is exactly right.
And the Medill School of Journalism. Are you coming to us from the Windy City? Is that where you are?
I am coming to you from the suburbs of Chicago. Yes, and we have a rare, beautiful, sunny day.
Well, which is odd. I always say I love Chicago, but there's too many cars and not enough road. That's the one thing I've noticed about it. We're going to be discussing your recent book, which I found fascinating. It's called Clash: Presidents and the Press in Times of Crisis. And we're not just discussing current presidents. You're going to take us way back even to John Adams. Am I right, sir?
That is absolutely right. I begin with the John Adams becoming president after George Washington and some of the tensions that he had with the press and the ways that he tried to restrict it. And it goes all the way through Joe Biden's inauguration.
This is great. We're going to talk all about that on the backside of this message.
This episode of E&P Reports is sponsored by IQ Audience Plus by Town News. Consumer revenue has never been more important. Digital leaders at media organizations worldwide are asking the same question. How do we accelerate the growth of consumer revenue? Traditional one-size-fits-all paywalls aren't the answer. They're blunt instruments that treat all visitors the same way, costing you money. IQ Audience Plus by Town News is a smart, dynamic metering solution that empowers you to maximize revenue by identifying key audiences, seeding engagement, and growing membership and subscriptions. Ready to supercharge your consumer revenue, grow engagement, and bolster your advertising income? Visit townnews.com/EP today to learn more about IQ Audience Plus by Town News.
Can I call you John? Is that okay, sir?
Absolutely. Call me John.
John, it's an honor to have you on the program. You know, I discovered you. You were doing an interview. I think it was on Morning Joe or a weekend on MSNBC. I was fascinated because I've always been kind of a closet historian. And I wrote a book that I call my million seller because I've got 1 million copies in my cellar. That's an old joke. You can use it if you wish. But I in my book are tons and tons of quotes. And on the back of my business card is the famous Jefferson quote about newspapers, right? I mean, to me, presidents, if you go back in time, have always kind of loved and hated the press. Am I correct?
That's absolutely right. Often before they take office, they say all sorts of nice things about the press, although I think Donald Trump was an exception to that. But Jefferson's a great example of that, and he has that famous quote: whether he could choose newspapers or the government, he would choose the newspapers. But then once he became president, he like most presidents had tensions and frustrations with them, and started to say things that he wished he could do away with that pesky press. So those tensions go back to the very beginning, and I think there should be tension actually between journalists and any politician, much less the president, because their goals are different. The president's trying to get their policy passed, trying to promote themselves, and if the journalist is doing a good job, they're digging into what the president is doing and asking tough questions. So there should be some tension, but it shouldn't be dysfunctional.
Now, I've always said that some very imperfect men wrote a perfect document. That the Constitution is still living today. It gets pulled at, right? And people try to shred it every now and then, but it's still a living, breathing document. And in there is these men saw a need for a free, unfettered press that would be, as you would say, like final check on power. So obviously, when you get the power, you resent someone looking over your shoulder. I mean, here's the quote I think that Jefferson said. He said, in a letter, advertisements can contain the only truths to be relied on in a newspaper. And he said, I do not take a single newspaper nor read one a month, and I feel myself infinitely happier for it. So he got a little angry. But let's go back in time. It was not easy, was it, for a free press to happen in America? You pick it up with John Adams, right? Why him? This is the first question I want to, not George Washington. You started with Adams?
I started with John Adams because George Washington, at least through his first term, enjoyed generally good press from the few newspapers and pamphlets that were out there. Washington was the great hero of the Revolution, of course. And some people thought he really should be treated more like a monarch and treated with great respect. And that lasted pretty much through his first term. And then starting in his second term, there began to be more and more criticism of him, especially from the emerging Democratic Republican Party of the time, which eventually became the Democrats, but that was Thomas Jefferson's party, James Madison's party, and they began to be jockeying for power and helping to promote and even pay under the table to support some of the new newspapers that were challenging Washington. But even then, it wasn't, compared to what they said about John Adams, wasn't especially nasty. And there wasn't the same kind of great crisis under Washington's term that there began to be with John Adams when the British and the French were fighting mostly at sea, and they were taking over American ships. And there was a big question about whether the United States should go to war on the side of France or go to war on the side of Britain. And the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were very much split over that. And there began to be a sense of crisis that the United States was about to enter a war, but we couldn't decide which side to enter on. And it got really quite furious in terms of the political rhetoric that was going on. And that's when John Adams decided to clamp down on the press. The Federalists in Congress passed the infamous Sedition Act, which made it illegal to utter or write anything that was critical of the government or especially critical of the president. And then they used the Sedition Act, both at the federal level and then the Federalist allies at the state level. More than 100 people were prosecuted under it, many of them the newspaper editors and writers, forcing quite a few of them to shut down as a result.
Not unlike what Vladimir Putin does on a daily basis in his own government. But people don't understand that this was actually unconstitutional law, but I guess it depends how you interpret it. But John Adams really did do that. How about Abraham Lincoln? I mean, everybody thought Lincoln was completely, totally pure when it came to his understanding of the Constitution, but the press took him on too as well. Am I right?
Right. Lincoln's always fascinating. That's why there's so many books written about Lincoln. And I think part of his greatness is his ability to change and to have some set opinions, but then listen to what was going on and take stock of what was happening in the country, which of course was another huge crisis, maybe our greatest crisis, and adjust and be flexible. So Lincoln, so two main themes in my book about Lincoln. One was that during the height of the Civil War, he did suppress the press quite a bit, particularly the military did, the Union military. And the Confederates did the same thing on their side. But the Union military would close down newspapers, would arrest editors, would restrict where reporters could go, would listen in on the telegraph wires and censor stories that they didn't like. Lincoln wasn't necessarily directly involved in that in most cases, but he would allow it to happen, and then he would say, okay, that went far enough. We need to ease back a little bit. And it's easy for you and I to criticize Lincoln for that now, 160 years later, but of course we're not in the thick of a civil war like he was, where hundreds of thousands of people are dying. So it was a much tougher question for him. But I also write about Lincoln's willingness to eventually support the abolitionist cause. He was originally opposed to abolition. He was anti-slavery. He always, as an adult, he was always on the record as saying, slavery was morally repugnant, and he opposed it spreading in new territories. But through most of his political career, he believed that slavery should be left alone where it already existed, and he didn't support the abolition of it there. But the abolitionist press gradually gained strength in the mid 1800s. And some of the fascinating stuff I came across is that Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon, who was one of his best friends, was much more supportive of the abolitionists. He subscribed to abolitionist newspapers, would read them to Lincoln. So Lincoln was hearing the abolitionist viewpoints on a daily basis from the abolitionist press. And when Lincoln ran for office, he was a smart politician. He was into the politics of addition, trying to build his coalition. He did reach out to the abolitionists and gained much of their support in the election of 1860, helping him to win. And then once he was in office, he didn't move quickly enough in the ways that the abolitionists wanted, exactly abolishing slavery, for one thing, or allowing Black troops to serve in the Union Army. But Lincoln started to invite abolitionists to the White House to meet with them. He invited Frederick Douglass to meet with him, and they would have long conversations. And he listened, which was, I think, part of his greatness. And his moral compass eventually aligned with his strategic compass for winning the war. And he decided that an Emancipation Proclamation was going to both help him politically as well as being the morally right thing to do. Allowing Union troops Black troops into the Union Army was going to help him win the war, as well as being the right thing to do. And passing the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, was both the right thing to do and was also going to help him politically. And that was part of his greatness.
Then you've got FDR. Every time, because I went to George Washington University, and I started my career in Washington, so I'm familiar with the bureaucracy of the city. And every time my wife and I visit there, and she says, "This is massive. There's so many workers; they have to stagger it." I said, "It was never like this till FDR became president, right?" I mean, one of the things he did was he created huge government. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a really right-wing press that took him on that, correct? And fought him vehemently about the expansion of government, the New Deal stuff, and all the different acronyms that he created, correct?
Exactly. So there are two things that really grew the size of the federal government. One was exactly what you said, the New Deal. Then, of course, World War II created this big defense establishment that was continued through the Cold War, and we still have it today. But getting back to your point about the New Deal, some of the leading publishers of that era were vehemently opposed to the New Deal. That included William Randolph Hearst, which I think most of your audience is familiar with him. He owned a large string of newspapers, owned a movie reel company in Hollywood, his magazines. He had a wire service, so very powerful. Initially supported FDR because he thought FDR would do what he said, and then FDR didn't, and it started increasing taxes, which William Randolph Hearst didn't particularly want to pay. So Hearst was one. Henry Luce, co-founder of Time magazine, by that point, the real leader of Time magazine, as well as then Fortune and eventually Life magazine, was very much opposed to Roosevelt and the News Deal, so the leading news magazine at the time. And then probably the most vehement of the mainstream press against Roosevelt was the Chicago Tribune back in my hometown. Colonel Robert McCormick just despised Roosevelt. And he would have on his front page cartoons and articles comparing Roosevelt to Hitler, comparing Roosevelt to Stalin, and very obviously backing, in 1936, backing Alf Landon, who ran against Roosevelt. So Roosevelt felt that the big publishers were against him, and he enjoyed very good relationships with the White House press corps. We can talk more about that, how he did that later. But Roosevelt felt he needed to get around the big publishers. And one reason he began his famous fireside chat, so he could talk directly to the American people and away from the gatekeepers of the press.
Not unlike social media.
Exactly.
How Trump managed to go around the press through Twitter. I mean, and it's fascinating. Everybody thinks that what's happening today is new. And what I love about what you're doing is you're proving something that I've always said. It's not been the past. We had just as much issues. I mean, there were just as many things. When you described what was going on with Lincoln, I was thinking to myself, my God, again, a party has a radical side to it, right? A fringe. And at that time, it was the abolitionist movement, and he had to move more in that direction through, I guess what you would say, through their influence, and the press was part of that. So what happened during the Trump era has happened in the past. Do you agree?
I mostly agree.
Okay.
With that, I mean, and I talk about this a lot in the book. There are plenty of precedents for what Trump did, and his presidency was the result of historical forces that led us that way. And as you mentioned, one of the precedents is using new technology as a way to reach the public, and which Roosevelt did, FDR did with radio, John F. Kennedy did with television. And then starting with Barack Obama and then Donald Trump using social media as a way to reach the public. She mentioned the George W. Bush White House was the first one to really use the World Wide Web as a way to appeal to the public as well. So there's this theme of using technology
to get around the press,
to reach the public, using new technology to get around the gatekeepers of the press. But there's also things that were, I think, unprecedented about the Trump presidency as well.
Such as?
Well, such as I mentioned, every president before Trump paid at least some lip service to the idea of the importance of a First Amendment and a free press. We talked about Jefferson earlier, at least when before he took office, extolling the free press, even though he got a little bitter about it later. Trump was really the first president to never publicly support the idea of the role of journalism in a democracy. And he's really the first to talk in violent terms and imagery about journalists. There was a famous meme he put out of, it was from a clip from a world wrestling competition, but it had the head of CNN,
right?
Instead of a wrestler getting pummeled by Trump when congressional candidate in Montana body slammed a reporter, I believe it was from the Guardian newspaper. Trump thought that was a fine thing to do. So Trump was really the first to talk about the press in violent ways, and to say that they're an enemy of the people, which was a phrase that Hitler used, Stalin used, Chairman Mao used, and then we have a U.S. president using it, and dictators around the world began picking that up again. So I think that was unprecedented about the Trump presidency. And then,
well, Nixon was kind of in that.
Nixon was obviously the closest to that. I think there's some differences there. Nixon behind closed doors said things just as antagonistic towards the press,
right,
as Trump did, and we hear it on the Nixon's White House tapes. Nixon had the strategy of casting the press as an enemy. Really, the first president who said, "Part of my political strategy is to say that the press is not representative of the American people." And as an institution, we should be concerned about in the same way we should be worried about crime or drugs. There's this press that's unrepresentative and it's dangerous. But Nixon didn't make those speeches himself. He sent Spiro Agnew, his vice president, out to make those speeches. He used the federal bureaucracy to try to get even with journalists he didn't like. But through most of his presidency, at least until really kind of the last days of Watergate, Nixon would still say that the free press was important, that he respected the role of journalists, which Trump really never did during his presidency.
I found it fascinating that JFK manipulated the press. Do you agree or disagree? I mean, one of his closest friends was Ben Bradley, right, from the Washington Post. And in some ways, Nixon alienated them. JFK befriended the press in a way that, do you not think that the press just loved him so much that they overlooked a lot of his shortcomings?
I think that's definitely true, especially with the Washington press corps.
Right.
And I should say every president tries to manipulate the press. That's part of their job.
But he did it.
JFK was good at it.
Yes.
And he had, certainly with people like Ben Bradley, people who were willing to buddy up with him. And I think that was something Ben Bradley shouldn't have done, and other people in the Washington press corps should not be that friendly with a president. There should really, I think, be a barrier between the reporters and the people they cover, whether it's a president or whether it's a city councilman at the local level. And I think the Washington press corps failed that during Kennedy's presidency. So that kind of buddy-buddy relationship, I think, is dangerous. And I will say the presidents, I think, who are generally most successful in their presidencies, the ones that historians rank the highest when they come up with lists of best presidents are usually the ones like JFK, like Franklin Roosevelt. I would put Ronald Reagan in that category, Abraham Lincoln in that category, ones who enjoyed friendly relationships with the daily reporters who covered them, got them on the whole better press coverage. And as you know, we say journalists write the first rough drafts of history. Those rough drafts of history influence the eventual final drafts of history that the historians make. So if you look at the lists of top-ranked presidents, by and large, they are ones who were good at working with the press and developing that sort of friendly rapport with them.
Tell me why
Teddy Roosevelt would be another example of that.
Oh yeah,
he was terrific at using his presidency to promote himself, and he would invite the White House press corps was much smaller in those days. He would invite them in as he got his morning shave and just kind of hold these impromptu, informal discussions with them, and they loved it. And he generally got pretty good publicity through the press.
You didn't mention Clinton when you were discussing someone who worked the press well. I mean, I know that the Monica Lewinsky thing and all that was another issue, but don't you put Clinton in that? He was an amazing communicator and was able to get his message out through the press, or not, sir? Do I have that wrong?
No, I would put him somewhere in the middle. In some ways, he was very good at it. He was really the first president to use television in a way that went around the news channels, and he would go on the late night shows.
That's right.
Famously went on the Arsenio Hall show, very popular at the time, put on his dark sunglasses, played his Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel on the saxophone, right. The audience dancing, and reaching out to kind of the rock and roll generation, which was at that point a younger generation.
Yeah, but don't forget, I'm just going to
I would consider myself the rock and roll generation, but
you didn't mention that Nixon went on laughing and said
you went on laughing for 10 seconds and looked a little awkward doing it, and that was the last time he did it. But Clinton did it repeatedly. He went on the Johnny Carson show. He would go on the Don Imus radio show and joke around and be a little bit raunchy about it. So Clinton, it was hard to imagine any other president before Clinton going on a show like Arsenio Hall's and doing anything like playing the saxophone or going on the Tonight Show.
But afterwards,
joking around like that. So in that way, Clinton was very good.
Yeah,
Clinton was very good at answering questions at length with reporters. He liked to think out loud, and he kind of enjoyed the give and take of those questions. And he famously would go out for his jogs around Washington and stop at a McDonald's, and the reporters would try to run after him. I guess he wasn't that fast, so they could catch up with him pretty easily.
I have pictures of that in my mind because I remember.
There's a great Saturday Night Live routine about it. Yeah. But he's he would answer questions in impromptu fashion with them. But Clinton's White House, at least in the first 2 years, was really disorganized. They didn't have a whole lot of Washington experience. His chief of staff, Mac McLarty, was an Arkansas utility executive, and from what I understand, was a very good Arkansas utility executive, but that's very different than running a White House in a political town like Washington. Clinton, in the first few months or first year or so of the Clinton presidency, he had two people who were holding press briefings. He had D.D. Myers, his press secretary, and George Stephanopoulos, his communications director, both holding press briefings, and they often contradicted each other. They weren't on the same page. And then Clinton got in trouble for firing the staff of the White House travel office. You may remember that was a sort of a scandal in the early years of the Clinton presidency, that they just fired everybody in the White House travel office, hired some people with political connections instead. And the reporters who traveled with the president really liked the people who worked at the White House travel office. They had treated them well, and they were really quite upset that they had been fired. And that didn't help Clinton's coverage as well. I think Clinton began to get his footing after the shellacking in the 1994 midterms, when the Republicans took over Congress, got a new chief of staff, a new communication strategy. They came up with a weekly plan for how they were going to deal with the media. And he got much better at it. So that's why we give Clinton kind of mid-range ratings.
All right, we don't want to give the whole book away because I know we want people to go get it. But let's touch on the press corps and the changes, because you said we've been discussing the presidents themselves, but you also touch on the culture of the press corps, right? And how that has changed over time. How different would you say it is today than it should be. Franklin Roosevelt, they honored no pictures of him looking like he was what he was. Well, he had polio. He couldn't walk. They always made sure he looked good. They looked the other way with JFK's discrepancies, right? I mean, the press corps knew, but never reported on it. There was kind of like this fraternal thing. Where are we today, in your humble opinion, with the press corps and at the White House, and where is the culture now, if I may ask you, in your opinion, with all this research?
Yeah, well, I think you're completely right that it changed. I think it really probably changed with Watergate and the Vietnam War era, when we had presidents blatantly lying, Lyndon Johnson and other presidents lying about the war, Nixon lying about Watergate. The level of suspicion among the White House press corps increased for good reason at that point. And I think that sort of suspiciousness is still there, as well as the feeling of, with Watergate, we uncovered this huge corrupt scandal. We need to keep looking and digging for those corrupt scandals. And there had been instances of that before with Warren Harding and the Teapot Dome scandal, but it wasn't as front and center as I think it is now. And I think the suspiciousness level is much greater now. And you're right, it's very different from Franklin Roosevelt's time, when he was giving his acceptance speech at the 1936 Democratic Convention, which was in Philadelphia in a big stadium. Roosevelt was walking up the ramp with knee braces on both his knees and holding on to his son on one side and an aide on another side. And one of his braces broke, and he collapsed and he tumbled to the ground. And there was this great concern of, obviously among his aides, everyone's scurrying around trying to get him up. Most of the crowd couldn't see it just because the way it was set up, but the reporters who were there could see it. But Roosevelt got up and they tried to fix his brace, and he hobbled to the podium and he kind of hung onto the podium with one hand, and the pages of his speech were all out of order now because those had fallen to the ground too. So he's trying to fix the pages of his speech, and he gives this brilliant address that is kind of remembered in history. But the reporters who were there never mentioned that he had fallen, and that he was wearing these knee braces, and that he was really disabled because of the polio. Can't imagine that happening now. Joe Biden stumbles, Donald Trump stumbles, it's at the top of the news, and it's being spread through social media instantly. So I think the presence of television cameras changes that. I think the instantaneous of social media changes that as well.
You don't spend a lot of time discussing, or at least what I mean, again, I told you before we started recording, I've only gotten through a number of chapters, and I just started leafing through and finding things I wanted to, discuss with you. But how about, the people who are on the podium? I mean, you mentioned Stephanopoulos. I mean, I watch religiously Nicole Wallace, right? Who went from, and Stephanopoulos also went from the podium to media. Is it that are the days of that fraternal, they loving each other and passing on the flak jacket? Is any of that uncovered in your book, and how these, and what they say, it's one of the toughest jobs in Washington, right? To be the one that has to be the presidential spokesperson, that the press corps constantly is trying to get gotcha all day long. Do you dive into that in the book at all?
I don't. I talk about some of the press secretaries, the ones, for instance, Woodrow Wilson was the first to have someone sort of play the role of a press secretary. It wasn't a formal title at that point, but Joseph Tumulty, his top aide, would meet regularly with the press and feed them information. And if they have a question, he would go try to research it and get them an answer. And that sort of set the precedent of what kind of role a press secretary could play. And he was quite effective, at least at first for Roosevelt, but then Roosevelt got more and more cantankerous towards the press, and he pushed tumulty away, and he no longer played that role, and that really ended up hurting Woodrow Wilson. Reagan, I talk a lot about his White House staff. James Baker, who was probably the most effective chief of staff ever, was great at understanding Reagan's strengths, understanding Reagan's weaknesses, and putting Reagan in positions where he could succeed, and running a very efficient White House. And then some of us may remember Reagan had a top aide, Michael Deaver,
Right.
who had been with Reagan from his California governor days, was very loyal to Reagan, was very close to the family, and really understood what would make Reagan look good, what would make Reagan be comfortable in front of the cameras. And the Reagan administration was really the first to master the imagery of the presidency on a daily basis, particularly for television.
Right.
Nixon's people tried it, and effective sometimes at it, but Nixon wasn't a natural at it. Reagan, of course, was a natural at it because he'd been a Hollywood actor, and he was great at learning his lines, great at understanding how to look at the camera, how to appeal to an audience through the screen. And his staff put him in positions where he could really succeed doing that. So now it's standard to see a president make a speech and there's a big American flag behind him, right? We'd kind of expect that with a presidential speech. Reagan's people were the ones who really got that huge American flag behind the president, or Reagan standing so that the sunset was beautiful sunset behind him, or Reagan riding his horse, on the range at his ranch. Or in a factory, shaking the hands of the men, wearing the hard hats. They were all about crafting the image, and they were great at that. There's a scene I talk about in my book where Reagan was visiting Boston, and he says that he supports completely doing away with the corporate income tax, which would obviously be a big change in tax policy. And at least most, directly affect higher income Americans, although Reagan would argue that it would trickle down to other Americans.
Right.
So the TV news people are talking about this policy and how it would affect the wealthy versus the working class people. But that same day, Reagan's people had him visit an Irish bar in Boston, and Reagan's there hoisting a beer with the working class folks in the Irish bar, and he's chatting with a priest, and he's telling jokes, and everyone's laughing, and they have their shoulders around each other. So the news of the day was Reagan talking about doing away with the corporate income tax. The visual of the day is Reagan having this great time in an Irish bar.
There you go.
These working class folks who just clearly love him, and that's the image. They understood the image would be much more longer lasting than any words that the newscasters were saying.
And they had a wonderful, wonderful subject to work with. Ronald Reagan knew exactly how to hit his mark and look directly into that camera, right? He could play any role in any situation. He was just a master. And when you have that kind of I hate to say it, but like our current president now, who just doesn't have that same charisma, that affects the public perception of the whole office and what they're doing.
Yeah, Reagan definitely had the charisma, just like FDR did, John F. Kennedy did,
Barack Obama.
They burned Barack Obama as well. Yeah. Reagan was also good. He was just naturally a genial person, friendly person, and there's stories of reporters during his California governor days saying, "Okay, we're going to go and do this tough investigative piece about this California governor who's making all these big changes and talking tough to the student protesters and all of that." And the reporters would get to Sacramento and spend time with Reagan, and they'd be like, "It's hard to write anything tough on this guy because he's just so friendly. No matter what's said, he's just still smiling most of the time." And there's repeated stories about that. And there were still tough stories written about Reagan, but he kind of smoothed out the edges, I think, quite effectively with that sort of friendly relationship that he was able to do.
He was amazing. All right. Well, the book, again, is called Clash, Presidents and the Press in Times of Crisis, Potomac Books. You have another book I do want to mention, Watergate's Legacy and the Press, the Investigative Impulse. And that's also Got very, very good reviews too, sir. And you are Jon Marshall. If someone wants to know more about you and or the book, you do have a website, which is Jon Marshall. Although, correct me if I'm wrong, you go Jon on the website.
I'm a Jon, John. So Jon Marshall, MARSHALL.com.
You're lucky to get
out
that.
About Clash and Watergate's legacy.
You must have registered that domain name decades ago to nail that, because Mike Blinder is not that, not a common name, so I easily got that one. But you are JonMarshall.com, which is wonderful. There must be a billion Jon Marshalls, out there.
There are. I actually had to pay someone for the,
there you go.
name. I wasn't that smart. I had a friend about 15 years ago who said, you should get JonMarshall.com. I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if it's worth it.
Now you got it.
No, I decided it was worth it. So
there you are.
More for it that I do have, JonMarshall.com.
And I have to tell you, I am here in Tampa Bay. I did stalk you a bit on the internet. You worked for the Tribune down here for a while.
I absolutely did. Yeah, I loved it down in Tampa.
How long ago was that?
That was 1991 into 1993.
Oh, my word.
I was up in Hernando County in Brooksville area. And it was a great place to be a reporter.
And it's still a wonderful town to live in, although Chicago has its benefits as well. Jon, it's been an honor and pleasure to have you on the program. We urge people to please check out Clash. This is an amazing book. It's fun read. I'll tell you that. You're an amazing writer, because the book just flows. It's just really, really well done. So thank you so much for sharing this with us on this episode of ENP Reports, sir.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for having me on.